Bardzo serdecznie witam Państwa w Instytucie Studiów Zaawansowanych. Dzisiaj naszym gościem będzie pani profesor Susan Buck-Morss, autorka książki Hegel Haiti, historia uniwersalna, którą można zakupić w naszej księgarni po promocyjnej cenie 25 zł. A dzisiejsze spotkanie i dyskusję poprowadzi profesor Agata Bielik-Robson, a pani profesor Susan Buck-Morss dyskutantem będzie doktor habilitowany Adam Lipszyc. Przesadziłem. A tymczasem oddam głos prowadzącej dzisiejsze spotkanie, profesor Agacie Bielik-Robson.
Dziękuję bardzo. Magistrze. It is my role today to lead this meeting with Professor Susan Buck-Morss on this book. Let me just say a few words of introduction before we begin this session. You probably all know Susan Buck-Morss. If you ever studied Hegel or Frankfurt School, it was a mythical reading. Everybody went through the ocean of negative dialectics, so surely you already know to the audience. I'll just. Can you hear me? Is it better now? Yeah. I'll just mention a few titles apart from The Origin of Negative Dialectics, which was a fantastic book on Adorno, Benjamin, the Frankfurt School. Then another book, Dialectics of Seeing, which was devoted to Walter Benjamin and the Arcades Project. Then The Dream World and the Catastrophe in 2002, The Passing of Mass Utopia in East and West. Then Thinking Past Terror on Islamists and Critical Theory on the left. And finally, Hegel Haiti and the Universal History, the book which is now translated into Polish. And from what I heard, the present project of Susan is on, well, apocalypse. But probably we'll go into discuss it later. Apocalypse, Christian messianism, Jewish messianism, and they're disparate, sometimes meeting ways. Okay. Well, anyway, let me just say a few words about the book we are going to discuss about today, hopefully without giving up too many spoilers. Well, as you can guess from the title, the main point of the book is to show that Hegel's main philosophical narrative, which is the famous dialectics of master and slave, or lordship and bondship, derives actually not from Hegel's philosophical, abstract discussion with the masters of the past, which was the usual way of interpreting this story in Hegel's phenomenology, like Aristotle, for instance. But, and this is Professor Buck-Morss' main point, it's actually Hegel's immediate reaction to the victorious uprising that took place on the Haiti island, where the black slaves rebelled first against the French white masters, then against the British invaders. The whole affair lasted 12 years, from 1792 up to 1804, and eventually led to the establishment of the Haitian Republic, which sported, as Professor Buck-Morss says, the first modern constitution declaring a universal freedom for all citizens of the Republic, actually by naturalizing them as black. And the funny thing, which you obviously know from your history lessons at school, is, and also Professor Buck-Morss mentions it, is the Polish participation in this whole affair. It must happen, right? This is the must element. Oh, sorry, a necessary discussion. Right, there is, but actually this is important. It is important. This is what is called Polish-Caribbean tragedy, and indeed it was a tragedy because it was a part of the Napoleonic wars in which the Polish troops participated with the hope that Napoleon will eventually grant Poland, not the whole Poland's independence, but create a little Princeton and well, save us from slavery, right? Save us from slavery. And obviously, there was a huge discussion among the members of the Polish troops as to whether participate or not participate. Shall we obey Napoleon, who sends us there to crush the rebellion of the black slaves, or shall we rather oppose it and say that, because of the matters of conscience, we cannot actually condone this counter-rebellion. The discussion was eventually won by the side represented by the obedience members of the Polish group, but as I said, the discussion lasted a very long time, and it actually reverberated with a strong echo in the whole 19th century. Most of the Polish romantic poets, like Norwich, for instance, they actually referred to it as indeed Polish-Caribbean tragedy. So the fact that Poland lost its innocence by taking part in this war. Although, as you also rightly say, some of the Polish members actually rebelled, right, and became the honorary members of the Haitian Republic, and their descendants live in Dominicana to nowadays. Another funny thing that probably you didn't know is that the head, they were under General Leclerc, but the person who was delegated directly by Napoleon to as the head of the Polish troops was Mulatto himself. He was, yes, Konstanty Jabłonowski. He was a child of the English aristocrat and this kind of a pet Negro that the English aristocracy used to have as the domestics, right, in their house, and rejected by this English aristocratic family and raised by a Polish general who actually lived between England and France, right? So, but he didn't fight because he died just 2 months after he arrived to San Domingo of yellow fever. But yes, he was in the last. So this is a kind of a long digression about this, but I thought we have to pay a service to the Polish, individual Polish narcissism in this discussion, Polish element. But coming back to your main thesis, that is that Hegel's narrative of master and slave dialectics, which forms the core part of phenomenology of spirit, actually is his direct reaction to these events. Okay, so your thesis, well, seems to me like sort of applying an Adornian strategy in a sense of that you're trying to defend Hegel against Hegel himself. Like Adorno famously said that in Dialectic of Enlightenment, we're trying to defend enlightenment against enlightenment itself. So here you're actually trying to show that Hegel, who, well, later on became rather conservative, and is rather known as someone who, well, in a very Aristotelian vein indeed, would rather blame the slaves for the fact that they became slaves and remained slaves. But actually, in his first reaction to this Haitian rebellion of black slaves, were actually full of admiration to them. And that this hope in the slave, right, or this what you rightly show as Hegel's investment in the way of in the history of the slave, in the emancipation of the slave, and in the history, the proper Western modern history is actually done by the slave, not the master, that this investment comes from Hegel's initial admiration of these black slaves and what happened in Haiti. Well, I don't want to talk too much about more. I have so many more questions. You can see many pages of this, but I don't want to stop the discussion for too long. So maybe I'll just pass it on to you now with this question. Well, maybe just you would like to introduce this book yourself to the Polish audience. Is there anything you would like to add now after this few years? Anything changed in the diagnosis? Because what I didn't say is the book is actually made of two parts. In the first part, this is this exposition of the arguments that Hegel took everything he needed for his master and slave dialectics from the Haiti rebellion. But the second part is the reply to the critics, which this essay calls, yes, universal history, and it's called Universal History. Well, in which you're not only trying to continue defending Hegel or what is valuable in him, but you also try to ward off the arguments of two parties, right? On the one hand, traditional Marxists, we can say, who opposed this book because they saw in it too much of particularism, so to say, messing up with their scheme of universal history, the necessary laws of history, something like an inevitable course of the transformation of economic formations, obviously focused very strongly on the West, right? Very Occidentalist. And the second party, post-colonial thinkers, who quite to the contrary saw in this book still too much of universalism, right? Too much selling into the white, predominantly racist, Occidentalist, West-centered history, right, which perceives the whole mankind through the lenses of those white dead philosophers. And, well, not giving a true voice to the victims, to the oppressed ones. So you're trying to sort of dialectically steer in between these two critical sides and show that there is a possibility of a universal history, right? Universal history, which can take actually all these post-colonial critics into account, right? Something that you call the new universal history, the new humanism. And well, my question is, are you still faithful to this project? And has anything changed? And have you thought some new reflections on what this new humanism and new universal history could be?
Oh, that was great. It's still by the book. I mean, you really have, been able to summarize the kinds of issues, the way the book enters a certain discussion, or multiple discussions actually, and tries to, as you say, steer in a kind of dialectical zigzag without, on the boundary between these opposed positions. And that's not a middle course, not a course that would be a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but that's the dialectics to it, that it's really precisely in its extremes it begins to come together. And you're right to say that there is a healthy dose of my background in the Frankfurt School that shows here, although I don't cite them. This is not, you know, something that I don't.
It shows.
But it shows for someone who knows. They know the roots. And as far as I mean, the one thing I would emphasize that perhaps you didn't as an academic. When I was doing this research, way back in the early 1990s, I actually had a summer a fellowship to be in Berlin. And people were, it's always these kinds of, the Germans always celebrate the birth, but most often the 50 years of the death of an author, right? So you always get more stuff coming out because somebody died 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, whatever. So there was some such, couldn't have been Hegel's death, I'm not quite sure what it was, but a whole mess of things were coming out. Oh, and also it was 200 years of the French Revolution. So suddenly books were coming out about the mulattoes in Bordeaux and their relationship to the Caribbean and how this would go in a kind of conceptual milieu, in the kind of universalism that was manifested in Freemasonry. Freemasonry is extremely interesting. It has very conservative moments in history, but other times very, very radical moments in history. And at this time, it was extremely radical. And it was the way you were, the way you had a kind of underground international. You know, it was the underground Communist Party of its time. Literally, arms runners between the United States and the Caribbean and Europe, and really extremely, is this okay? Is this good sound? Okay. So extremely interesting, and also interesting because it wasn't like a philosophical thing that came down. You know, Freemasonry was about during these kind of in the aftermath of colonialism, discovering in ancient Egypt certain signs that were the same, actually a fascist sign that you find also in Western Sub-Saharan Africa and in Ethiopia. Suddenly, it looked like these things might be universal in some way, and they became this way of kind of symbolizing some sort of global space of potential solidarity. And that's what I kind of want to emphasize here, because there's a book by a kind of unorthodox Marxist. The book is written by Leinbau and Rediger, and it's called, what's it called? Leinbau and Rediger, Many-Headed Hybrid. Yeah. And it's about the kind of pre-proletariat proletarian. So they would be the people who actually, sailed the ships. They would be the sailors. They would be the builders of the ports. They would also be the slaves. They would be anybody who actually did the work to produce colonialism, right? And so it resonates with that kind of interest as well. These people were very cosmopolitan, and they were new humanists. This was an underside of the Enlightenment, working class Enlightenment, where people, were intermarried among races and, were extremely pro-women's equality, and there was a lot of this, really, really radical thought. And that also points out, and here I would think that Adorno is still too alien and sees somehow ideas evolving out of their own inner contradictions. I mean, there is no stagism in the consciousness of these people. They understood better than we do today what it means to have equality among differences, right? And so a lot of the lasting impression on me of doing the research for this book is to really give up this idea that we can talk about any history of ideas, as if it had some sort of, Koselleck and Begriffsgeschichte, which is a kind of right? Then be a Hegelian. Don't, you know, make it a watered-down version of that by saying not the idea of history, but the history of ideas. This is the inversion that turns it into something very tepid. Now, I say this as someone who is trained in intellectual history, so I love it. I love it. But it cannot be defended from a political point of view, because it puts way too much weight on the thought and not the thinkers and the actors. And as I say, very often, the more radical actors are precisely way in advance of any development and unfolding of the idea. And then, of course, those advances are taken back in history. You know, so it's a jagged kind of process. And so that stays with me as something, you know, I was a history major. I love history. Something about, I remember being in 8th grade, you know, and having the history of the United States. It was in a book. Anything else you could have, like, packaged. We had bird's eye peas, frozen peas. They were also packaged. But the history of the United States, the history of the United States wasn't packaged. And you could open it, and you could do this wonderful outline of the history and know everything that happened. It was so satisfying. It was so satisfying in your hand. And of course, then to find out that it was that you know, on the one hand, I still think that philosophy should care about what happened in history. That's the positivist side, right? On the other hand, the way history is packaged and brought down to us is total ideology. So how do you save, and I mean this in a rather Benjaminian way, how do you rescue that content, which is all we know about human beings, right? How do you, and the Germans, and but mainly the Germans, in the 19th century did, you know, enormous work in simply retrieval of the past. And then you have archaeologists and you know, art historians, and so many people have been involved in this project of somehow rescuing the past. This happens after theology no longer seems to carry the weight of the task of understanding what the human mission is. And so history becomes a kind of ontology of modernity. And I still think you can't throw it away and become Heideggerian and just say it's not about actual history, it's about historicity. I will not go that route, right? So the idea then is how do you rescue the past in a totally different configuration? So I guess this means that most of what we do in universities is history. We do the history of literature, the history of art, the history of history, the history of, you know, I mean, it's only social sciences and those, you know, sociology, well, I know sociologists could hear it, less so. But you know, in other words, if you're not going to do just data collecting of the given, then you're going to add to it history. So the project can happen any place. Here it happened to be Hegel in Haiti. And I started this riff, and I came in today from New York, so this will go up and down. There'll be moments of being very awake and then moments of not so awake. But this is a non sequitur from what I just said. But going back to the 1990s, I'm in Europe, and I'm finding out that books have come out in French too about the colonial connection. And then books in German are coming out on Hegel. And this whole moment, which is also important to Axel Honneth, who took it in a very different direction, right? This moment of Anerkennung, this moment of recognition. So the master-slave dialectic is back in a different configuration with Honneth and certain Habermasian, but also with certain French thinkers who are exactly. Yes, exactly. So these two models were very much in discussion. But I just said to myself, well, Hegel wrote this in 1804, well, four. The existing Sittlichkeit is 1803. Then you have 1804, 1805, the Jena writings, and then 1806 is when the phenomenology comes out. And then if you look at these notes that they're ever churning out these Germans, right? Of lectures that somebody, you know, attended by Hegel's lectures that were attended, and you see that with the early writings as well, there is this moment where the word sklava first comes in to the texts. And I had remembered 10 years earlier reading some very influential article in New Left Review that said, oh no, sklava isn't important, it's not master-slave, it's Knechtschaft, it's Herrschaft, Knechtschaft, it's all of that, just this relationship of domination has nothing to do with slaves. Because he uses the word knecht. And yes, in the phenomenology he does. But in the notes, and in the lectures, and in his early writings that were not published until way after his death, sklava is there. And it's there, and this is what I found so fascinating, it's there just as in 1803 he reads Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And he understands from Adam Smith a totally new definition of die bürgerliche Gesellschaft. It's no longer civil society as it was in Aristotle's day, but it is precisely private property and its sale. So it's what's going on in cities in 1800, and that is mercantile capitalism, right? So it's not, alienation means simply the capacity to alienate property. That's what ownership was all about. So people were, there was a book that came out about Hegel's reception of Adam Smith, right? There is the French Revolutionary connection, which was again in the air. But when it came to slavery, the experts were still saying, oh, it was only about Aristotle. Or it was a totally abstract idea. But, you know, the slaves were regarded. So I kept on doing research then on the reception of the Haitian Revolution in Europe. And I didn't know all of these details of the Polish story, but it goes to show that what really was striking to people was the fact that these people who were supposedly slaves actually took the idea of freedom further than anyone in Europe had done, or in the American Revolution, right? And this was you know, one of the sources that I cite says, the eyes of the world are on Haiti. And it is an event, whatever you think of it, that philosophers have to be concerned about. Now these writings were in a certain journal. The journal's name was Minerva. Minerva, ladies and gentlemen. That was the name of the journal. And it was published and drew on the writings of some very famous people like Klopstock and I can't remember the names, but there are a lot of people who were actually active. Lafayette, the King of Prussia, read Minerva. And then I found it. So anyway,
and it's the German Freemasons.
And it's the German, thank you, and it's all Freemasons, right? And this is the other thing that's so fascinating. All of the stationery stores, all of the places that sold paper were Freemasons. That was what publishing was. It was a Freemason, kind of like you have here, actually, what I've seen. You have a branch in Ukraine, and you have a branch in, you know, you have these, you're kind of beginning to
One of it is being secret.
Yes.
Don't tell anyone.
So this is, okay, so for instance, there is a book this thick, this thick, on the watermarks on Hegel's manuscripts. The watermarks are the mark indicating which stationery store he bought it from. And because Hegel moved almost every year between 1806 and 1818, when he ended up Berlin, not every year, but he moved around a lot because he didn't have a job, right? He would buy his stationery, and you could then date his manuscripts by the watermark on the paper, you know? So, like, it's not as if people hadn't worried about minutiae when it came to Hegel scholarship, but no one, and there were 2 monographs on the journal, Minerva, but they don't mention Haiti. And so I'm like, it's all kind of falling into place and everything, and I'm kind of feeling confident, and then, 6 years later, 7 years later, I was in the basement of the library at Cornell University, and I found it. I found on microfiche, I found the journal Minerva. And going through it, what happened was in 1804, 1805, actually in the early part of 1804, the editor, who was a Freemason, said, we are going to do a 10-year retrospective of the Haitian Revolution that has just come to be named Haiti, right? It just come, and as you say, everyone, by being black, became part of the Haitian Republican conception. And so they said, this is a story that has to be told. So they went back for 10 years, and they began to do a series of articles that would come out in each issue that would deal with the stage of the Haitian Revolution. And, and then you see, all these people are reading it, and so is Hegel. Right? Now people say, oh, well, maybe he just, didn't read that part. That's exactly when
he was looking for the funny.
That's exactly when, the word Slav is first used in this idea of the dialectic of mutual recognition. Before that, he has a kind of Christian idea, and in between, he has an idea of 2 people in love, which Axel Honneth likes a lot, But then he finally says Slav, right? So this, and then I got mad. I did. I got mad. Because I had been working on this for 10 years. I wrote that one article rather quickly, with a lot of anger. And when I first gave the talk, someone in the audience said, well, why are you so angry? And I said, well, how could I be so old and be so dumb? Why is it that I could have studied history all my life, studied Hegel,
Never made the connection.
never made the connection, and when I thought there might be a connection, I was way too intimidated by the Hegel experts to say anything about it, right? And this strikes me as there's a moral to this story. It's something it's what not to do, right? You shouldn't deal with history in that way, particularly because I consider history so important for any kind of philosophical or theoretical understanding. So I would say that this suspicion of the disciplines and their boundaries, and the way, if you're a Hegel scholar, you look at what happened in the Caribbean. It's trivial.
Lazy existence.
It's exactly what Hegel calls falę existence, lazy existence. And yet, if you're a post-colonial scholar who reads Glissant, who actually is the one who talks about new humanism, and I didn't realize how indebted that term is to him, because I had heard humanism used in a much more liberal, conservative way, but it's actually Glissant, Edouard Glissant, who speaks in terms of the new humanism, also Césaire, right? So all of the scholars who were doing black history didn't want to read Hegel. So, and I'm very proud because the English version did win the Frantz Fanon Prize. It's given, that meant a great deal to me. It's actually the daughter of Fanon who presents it. But there was a hefty discussion I heard when they were considering the book for the prize, because they said, she's not black, it's not black history, right? I mean, Dessalines wouldn't have said that, right?
It's not post-colonial enough, right?
Right, it's not post-colonial enough, right? So then I am on rather, yeah, and for me, it's now a very productive place to keep hanging out. In other words, you stay on that border. People are defending that border. Why? There must be some reason why you better annihilate that border, right? That border is giving trouble. That border is there for very ideological reasons. Who are the disciplinary police who tell you you can't go there, right? And how are we teaching our students when we tell them, oh, you know, I mean, I realized it when I wrote on Islamism. After 9/11, I figured I know nothing about political Islam. Maybe as an American, maybe I owe it to the degree of concern of Islamists to read something, you know. And when I wrote that very short book, which is not by an expert, but when I wrote that book, my colleague said, oh, what a courageous thing, but I never would have done that. I don't speak Arabic, you know. Well, I read everything in translation that existed in English, and you know, obviously, my level of expertise is secondary. And same with this. I'm not an expert in Caribbean. I'm not an expert. And Casey did a fantastic translation. That should also be said. She's wonderful, and it looks wonderful. The pictures are there, the Freemasons are there, etc. So I think that this, I forget what I was saying.
You're not an expert in Caribbean.
I'm not an expert, but I have an obligation. I have an obligation to go into that area. We can't hide behind our desire for authority from a certain kind of politically urgent work. So I would say that's the thing that sort of stays with me. And then, now this is another book that just came out, Judaism and Contemporary Thought, and it's edited by my two colleagues on left and right, or both on my left, I guess. And so Agata and Adam have this book that I get to borrow for overnight, and then it goes into some display case here. But they're working on Benjamin, Jewish messianism, apocalypses, and really interesting stuff. And I have to say that I'm working on the 1st century AD, and I'm working on John of Patmos, who wrote Revelation. We now know in 95, we used to think he wrote it before the Jewish wars, but that's wrong. So it's not a prediction, it's a reflection, it's a historical reflection. He was a historian, right, in the prophetic mode. So that resonates with Benjamin, and then things kind of begin to get interesting. And also, of course, it's written in Greek, like everything was written in Greek. You know, Nero gave speeches in Greek. Who knew, right? And of course, Seneca was his advisor, teacher, tutor, whatever. So if there's the whole classical tradition, which is proudly anti-religion, right? Then there's the whole Christian tradition, which has really screwed up its inheritance of Jewish messianism. And then there's the Jewish messianic tradition, which has its problems. I love Benjamin because Benjamin says, you know, the best thing about me and other Jews is not Jewish. And yet he considers that to be, he said, even if Germans said it 100 times, non-Jewish Germans, to him, it's still the best thing about him as a Jew. See, so there's this refusal to be, you know, Ukrainian versus Russian. I'm just using this as a contemporary example, you know. And so this absolute refusal to be collectivized in a way that allows for political control. And political control can work on the level of scholarship as well as the level of governments and politics. So I think that is sort of what I would say. I've taught a lot of the book, but it's still good reading. And the footnotes, and the footnotes, anybody who knows my work knows I'm really big on footnotes, which probably drives publishers crazy, and Kezia absolutely crazy. But there's a lot of backup. I really feel if I'm doing this kind of work, and I'm not doing original scholarship, that I better cite very carefully my sources. So, yeah, that's what that's about. Now I'm going to send this over to Adam.
Well, what should I say? Well, no, I really don't know what to say. But my problem here is that I like the book immensely, and I really cannot. I was desperately trying to find something I didn't like about the book, so that I would not ask you a question or criticize you somehow, but I couldn't find anything like that. So I'm serious here. So I would just say a word, sort of emphasize the points that were there, obviously, but which I found so interesting in the book. Well, on the most general level, philosophically, on the most general level, it is the thing that Agata already mentioned, which is that you defend this, I would say, courageous and somehow anachronistic defense of the idea of universal history. This is something I found so cool in this book, that you take this term, which is really discarded as conservative, eurocentric, whatever, right? And you're very powerfully arguing that from cognitive, but also from, at the end of the day, really from moral point of view, this is something we need to defend as a term, as a perspective, as you say, as a methodological perspective rather than as ontology, right? But still as a very strong moral perspective, although completely changed, written upside down or something, but still as a universal, seen as a universal history. So this is something I really found very, very powerful in the book, and the fact that you are so carefully making this reversal of this idea. It's kind of, I would say, alter globalist is a universal history, right? You're doing something like we are not giving away this term universal. We are going to be universal, but in a different way, right? So the idea that the world historical events are not, say, the Battle of Vienna, but the revolution in Haiti, which is so not the central, from European perspective, not the central events, but something that from European perspective is somewhere there on the margin, and it is an anomaly, but the anomaly is in fact something world historical, and in this sense central, right? By being anomaly, but an anomaly by being marginal. So this is something incredibly powerful. And what I found really moving at the end of the first part of the in other words, at the end of the original essay, right, the Hegel in Haiti, is this swift, this short passage in which the methodological, or even I would say philosophical, historical passage in which you, in very simple words, without doing any kind of metaphysics of history, you are actually stating something you're making very, very strong points about the task of a historian, right? And the actual, I would say, even dynamics of history. The moment when you are saying that there is, and this is clearly Hegelian, right? And although you're not quoting Benjamin at that time, but very clearly Benjamin, that you point to this fantastic constellation, that you make this strange short circuit between this meeting, encounter between Hegel and Haiti, which is so shocking, right? Which I'm going back to it in a second. But so you're bringing them together with those two H, right? And then you're bringing them together, and you're saying, okay, so let's have this constellation, which will be seen from our point of view, from our now of knowability, right? We see it now, and you're saying this was covered by silence. You're talking a lot about Hegel's silence about his actual source, or the supposed source of inspiration. That Hegel is silent about it, right? Being this underdog intellectual, he's careful. He's careful to be silent about his source, but you see it, right? And you see as your task to break the silence, right? So from this point of now of knowability, from our point of view, we suddenly see this constellation, and you see, well, now this is something, and suddenly you're using very sublime, big words about actually, you do say, it wasn't my imagination, you're actually talking about absolute spirit. You're saying, well, if there is it makes any sense to talk about absolute spirit, this is the moment, right? You have this fleeting moment of recognition of what freedom is about in the Haitian Revolution. You have this fleeting moment of recognition in thought in Hegel what freedom is about, and also in the action of those Polish, slightly legendary, half-legendary soldiers that decided that they are going to fight on the Haitian side, and that your task is to bring these things together, right? In order to both to bring, on the one hand, bring Haiti into the universal history, and then make Hegel, well, sort of make him crush against the contingent, against the marginal, against the, and make him, and sort of make him, put him upside down, right? So, so this is something incredibly powerful. So it really doesn't make any sense to talk, because I'm just saying how I like it more. But there's one thing I thought about when you were talking about how angry you were, right? That you discovered it that late, that nobody taught about that link, right? And this is something you talk about in the book itself, and this is really interesting. That because the book is about many things. It's thin, but it's about so many things. One thing is that you're saying now we don't see it. We don't see the revolution, so we don't talk about the revolution so much, unless we are doing colonial studies and post-colonial studies. We don't talk about it that much. Definitely we don't talk about it when we're doing Hegel, right? But then, as you say, was something unbearable, but something that couldn't be not seen, right? It was something so visible. They were talking about it, they were seeing it because it was on the news in Minerva, right? So, but we are not. For us, it is covered. The connection, the revolution is partly, obviously, we do know about it, but it's a marginal event, especially from Polish point of view. And especially the connection is covered. What I found so interesting is that what you're doing here is actually doing something very rude, right? In terms of, like, on purpose, like you're doing something very rude by saying, why are we being so metaphorical? Why are we being so metaphorical about the dialectic, the master-slave dialectic? Let's be literal for a moment, okay? This is a rude thing to do, right? So you're showing how this Hegelian dialectic was turned into metaphor the very second it was published, right? Oh, this is a metaphor of bourgeois under the absolutist government. Oh, this is a metaphor of worker in the factory. This is a metaphor of this. This is a metaphor of that, right? And this teaches us something also. I'm not so sure how universal this lesson is. I couldn't think about it, I didn't have time to think about it, but how universal it is that you make history speak again by making something that we treated as metaphorical for so many, that we've treated as metaphorical for so many years. You suddenly say, oh, let's read it literally for a second, okay? And this is actually what produced this link, right? And turned the whole perspective of how we might see history. So a very powerful, I don't know how universal a lesson it is, but it sounds pretty universal. That when you're saying somewhere in the beginning of the book that facts are about changing your imagination, right? Or changing that facts are there to make us think, by switch perspective. So yeah, this is what you're doing here. You're somehow going down to one small fact, one small connection, right? And then it turns out that it switches the whole perspective, right? And produces this, alter modus.
I totally agree with that. That's actually not only a promise, like a future of universal history. You practice it.
This is
exactly what I mean. This moment in which you break the play of metaphors, right? Which is obviously, I mean, if the wrong universal history is done, it is always done because it dissolves everything concrete, right? In the what Taubes, apropos Hegel, also infuriated with is called the inner play of a metaphor, precisely, right? So it's a kind of the wrong universalism is produced by this absolute dissolution of factum brutum, of the brutal facts, right? And well, for Taubes,
root connection between Hegel and Haiti, right?
Brutal, it's factum brutum. The Taubes, when he criticizes Hegel from the Jewish Messianic perspective, right? He wants to move Hegel into more factual domain when he will be really confronted with brutality. He sees it in Kierkegaard and Marx especially, right? This is a Hegelian who is bold enough to confront himself with the brutality of fact. But you actually show it that it's already in Hegel.
Or
so
this
is this defending Hegel against Hegel himself and his later reception as the master player of the sort of inner game of metaphor.
Yeah, to pick up on what you said about Marx is that you're criticizing this Marxist metaphorization of this, and you're actually saying, in this sense, you're saying that Marx thought that he's going to the brute facts, right? Those crude facts, but you're actually saying you're still being metaphorical, right? You're still being in this mist of this fog of concepts, of metaphors, right? So you say, well, let's strike down to the actual. It's one actual connection. So sometimes positivism helps, right? So in this, as a moment in dialectics, obviously it's only a moment of dialectics. You're not a positivist historian, right? But you suddenly turn for a second. You turn positivist, right? It's like this fleeting moment of positivism. That you and literality, right? So you're saying, oh, let's be literal, right? So this is extremely powerful, I think. And this also just a word. This also suddenly turns the relationship between the present and the past so powerfully, because then it turns out that you really need a standpoint somewhere later, right, in this now of knowability, right? You cannot be Hegel, right? You cannot be in this. He is in a moment of silence. He may be in a moment of recognition, but still in a moment of silence, right? And you need a later moment, like the one you were writing in, right? In which you suddenly are possible to cut through this fog, right, and rescue this moment, right, and rescue this fact, right. I was not going to say something about Cochet, but maybe Suzanne should say something.
I'm going to say something about Cochet.
No, I wanted to say something.
Okay.
Your
response. That was so great. You know, this reminds me of what Hegel said about Goethe in the Phenomenology. He says, when Goethe says, oh, that was a really interesting book, he's really saying Goethe is a very interesting reader, which is, of course, dialectic. And I have to say that these are two extremely interesting readers. So that, you know, but that's great if that happens when you're working. I mean, nothing could be better. I mean, there's also the people who read your stuff and say, oh, I love it. And then you hear what they got, you think, oh, yeah. No, it can be horrendous. You can think, why did I do this? But I mean, so this is really, really, really nice. And I don't know if it can be done all the time either. This worked.
Yeah, this worked. I'm not sure.
Otherwise, you might just be doing brute factual history. And that's a problem I have with the first century, for instance. That's why it's been a long time since this book has not really seen the light of day. But it's very hard. It has to, and you're absolutely right. It's Benjamin's notion of rescuing the past in a different constellation, the readability, and also, oh, this is what I want to say. This is interesting. I didn't realize it, and I'm working with this word now that is. I don't know how it's worked in its translation into Polish, but the word is eingedenken. And it's translated into English as, it's a word from Benjamin. Very important for his philosophy of history. It's in the theses on philosophy of history, but it's in other documents as well. Eingedenken. It's translated simply as remembrance. But, who is it? John McCole has a book on Eingedenken, and Max Pensky has also written about this word. And I think that Jonathan Cole, it's an older book from the 1990s, it's very important with that word. It doesn't exist in German. It's a coinage from two, Eingedenk and Eindenken, I think, are the two. And this puts them together, and the gay there, is like the gerund. It's the motion. And what it actually means is not remembrance in the sense of, oh, let's remember, or let's feel bad every year about the Holocaust and everything else, right? But it's rather because we know what it is that we're supposed to feel bad about. But no, it's a very impolite interruption from the past. And so the best translation in English for Eingedenken is interrupted memory, or interruptive memory. Interruptive memory. It comes at you, and it makes something happen in your mapping of reality. And precisely, unfortunately, the kind of reverent remembering of the past smooths that over. Tradition can be extremely murky in that way. I mean, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. You know, because how far do I want to go in actually obliterating tradition? Well, I can't do it, but you know, affirming that as a necessary measure. Because if you look at for instance, you know, remembering the Holocaust that Germans do all the time, you can do that while you're absolutely destroying a generation of Greek youth through your, you know, oh, they shouldn't be so lazy, they should work harder when it's good for them to get some sort of lesson in financial responsibility. I'm not equating the two horrors. I'm just saying that we are responsible. We who are alive today are responsible for the ones going on here and now. Those are the ones that we can't talk about how we feel so good because we're remembering our responsibility for the past in a way that obliterates that kind of responsibility today. So that connects with an idea that I'm working with, a communist inheritance of the past. That the past is a gift, and that Haitians gave us a gift, right, of radical freedom. It's a gift because we can't give back, and because we may not even receive it. We may deny it, we may not even know it. But that, so for me, history or tradition as that kind of gift that is there for anyone. It doesn't belong to Haitians. or blacks, or any, you know, what is that? That's such a possessive notion of the past, but it's really, the idea would be then a communist inheritance of the past, but you really take that word communism and give it some meaning that would be worthwhile. So, back to you.
Well, Anna mentioned Kojève already, and I wonder if I have exactly the same point to make about Kojève.
Let's see.
Because, let's see, because I was actually very struck by how Kojèvian your reading of
No.
of the master slave is. Maybe, and I didn't think so at the beginning, and then I was really struck by this. Because in Kojève, I mean, what is the most important thing is confrontation with death. So there is only one way to freedom. There is only one way of becoming a man, a human being, a one anthropogenic model. That is, it must be a direct confrontation with death. So liberty or death, a possibility of going through the peril of death, is the absolutely necessary condition of a liberation. And I always thought that this is a very strong misreading of Hegel, because my impression was that although I totally agree with you that Hegel is very ambiguous on this point, and he sometimes suggests that the only way for the slave is actually to like shake the bonds and confront the master in yet another like death-defying situation. But sometimes he suggests that there is another model of emancipation. And in a way, the whole of the analogy of spirit is built on it. It's like a slow historical maturation of the slave subject who stops being a slave, not by confronting the master in the struggle, but by working. So work becomes like another concept, another possibility of emancipation for the slave, and it's an alternative model. And now my question is, if there is this alternative reading, right, of slave emancipation, then maybe Hegel indeed was also not just in a sheer admiration of what happened in Haiti, but maybe it was also like tangential towards it, also partly critical, in the sense that he criticized the idea of the struggle. Right? That is, the struggle does not really lead anywhere. It is not a proper means of emancipation, because as you also yourself write about it, the struggle perpetuates the struggle. Right? I mean, the struggle leads to yet another outburst of violence, then the outburst of violence calls the revenge house to reply in violence, and basically we never leave the cycle of violence. The victims of avengers, and we need to leave the cycle. So maybe Hegel's idea of the emancipation through work was actually his answer to leading out, to the exodus from the world of self-perpetuating cycle of violence.
A couple of things. One is, I think that the Marxist appropriation of the master-slave dialectic is so strong that work, it's impossible for me not to see so much of that appropriation going on. So, although I've gone there with you as I've been working on this project, but then that stops me somehow, and I think I am then, you know, where it gets bad is when Eric Williams, coming from Rome, Jamaican scholar who went to England and in the 30s talked about slavery as a modern phenomenon and was told by Marxists, no, it's not modern. Slavery is an ancient phenomenon. Free labor is modern labor. And so Eric Williams' work was not capitalism and slavery, was simply ignored. So there's so much of that prejudice, that stagism, in the Marxist tradition that for me it's hard to rescue that. I don't know what the actual constellation would have to be that would allow you to rescue that. One. Two, the Haitian Revolution did succeed. And not only that, it spread. Simon Bolivar brought it to other countries in Latin America. And they were Spanish-speaking countries. The Spanish were not into the French revolutionary situation at all, right? So here was a way that it did spread. So I do think that he understood a kind of, it wasn't just that he was inspired by the Haitian Revolution, but he could see that this idea of freedom was universal because these Black Africans understood it and could take it to a higher level. But it was not a level that stuck historically. It did not spread to other places in the Caribbean. It certainly did not end slavery. Right? And slavery was reestablished in the colonies, or, well, it wasn't overthrown, but so Haiti does remain free, but in terrible situation economically. So free labor was getting a very bad reputation because it was not, it didn't seem that they might be able to rebel, but they were not able to work in a productive society. So, and that makes me very aware of what you're saying, because it's not even just the facts, it's somehow making a constellation that will make something go on in your head. And it is also this notion of something fleeting. It may not always be that. I mean, if someone then learned as their ground, okay, now everyone will learn in school that Hegel and Haiti belong together, it would whatever truth was there, whatever power was there, would disappear. And it is the power of an idea, which is also a kind of Hegelian theme. In all of these kinds of discussions, for me, Benjamin is so infinitely useful, because some of what we're describing and I've experienced, he was the one to articulate it as philosophically as I've seen it articulated, whereas for Adorno, it's still a kind of inversion of the Hegelian story. It's still a kind of Marxian, Lukácsian idea. And as I say at the end of that book on Adorno had no interest in traveling to third world countries. He just was very happy in the European intellectual tradition. So, but obviously what you're saying is true. So the question is how to revivify that. Benjamin's the one who says not everything is citable at all times. How to revivify that without allowing it to pull whatever work this other constellation is doing, without pulling it back into the same old story, or like, this one New Left Review person says, going on a hunch, nothing more. He says review number. I would say that Hegel didn't care about it. Because he didn't read the book in any kind of serious way. Going on a hunch, nothing more. Which is, if I use the patterns of my imagination that are already in place, of course I'm going to see that there's no connection. But how do you change those patterns? How do you actually give them a shock, right? So, but you want to say why it's not cliche?
From a completely different point of view, but one thing about Benjamin is that how Benjamin works in your book, whom you don't quote so much, maybe once or twice, but then you can feel it there. And one of the cool things about the book is that you simply make Benjamin operative, like working there, right? I mean, there are so many different ways in which it can be made, but here you simply works for you, right? There's this moment actually a footnote to this essay that Kasia forwarded to me, which is History, universal history written upside down or something like that. Yeah, in which you're saying that the event, this big event that you were talking about, this constellation, you would read in the lines of the Adornian and Benjaminian theory of the name, right, of the proper name. Which I was really happy that you're doing it this way, right? That you're exactly, that you're finding this moment of freedom, this event of freedom appearing both in action and in thought, bringing them together and actually turning them into this constellation from your point of view as the actual gestalt of name, right? As the actual shape of name, which is indeed fleeting, right? No, when it comes to Kojève, I just wanted to say something very, very simple, which does not contradict what Agata said, although I'm not, I mean, okay, that's, I'm not going into this word thing again, but you did it. What I meant is that from some point of view, Kojève can be seen as, if you look at, say, Fukuyama as a Kojèvian thinker, you can see Kojève as the founding father of seeing of turning Hegel into the philosopher of there is no alternative philosophy, right? Of what Kojève called the homogeneous universal state, right? That the battle of Vienna is something that leads us to this homogeneous universal. That's simply what I meant, right? And here you're in this Kojève, right? And you're in this with this very small, allegedly marginal thing. You're turning this Kojèvian line, if this is what Kojève means now, right? Upside down, or you're making this rude, impolite, perverse reversal of it into this counter-universalism, right? You're offering some kind of a counter, which is obviously, if we pick up on this phrase, again, homogeneous and universal state, you're for something like, well, definitely not homogeneous, rather not one state, right? But still universal, right? But still universal history, which opens in those fleeting moments. So I also wonder, there's something that is linked to what you mentioned about this Hydra book, that there is something of a shift into, I would say, I think you're using the phrase something like extended Atlantic community or something, that we're doing some kind of a imaginary shift from land to sea. I mean, that you're sort of urging us to think of, not in Eurocentric terms, not in Americocentric terms simply, but in terms of some kind of a that would be an Atlanticocentrism, which cannot be centric at all, right? Because it's not homogeneous. It's deconstructed from inside. So this shift I also really like. Although there is a question I think I might ask now at this point, which is that I think in the introduction to the book you're saying that if you would accuse me of being like too much centered on the American experience, I would say that yes, we have something to contribute to this universal story, which is not American imperialism, but our experience of slavery and fighting against slavery and the struggle against slavery. This is our sort of American contribution, so to speak, which is a very smart move, right? But still you might say, aren't you still, yeah. I have to finish. No, the thing is, do you read? Oh, you read the public.
What did you forget about?
The people. We the people.
Yes.
Okay, so my question is, aren't you still being very America-centric here? And is it really a contribution? Does it really contribute to European experience or European presence? We've been talking about just. Okay, that's it. Okay, so
That's fair. but I won't answer.
Okay.
Because I better.
Well, before we open the discussion, the floor, I thought that we would still just say just a few words. No more about project. I mean, we're not going to agree here. Really, I was thinking about actually like rescuing also the concept of war away from Marxists, but it's a different floor.
Yeah,
I think,
but a very good one.
yes, yeah. Well, if you have like rescue liberation through death is particular notion, so I also think about rescue work from this like mythology of free labor and so on and Marx. But what we I think also need to discuss is this apart from this very ingenious use of Benjamin and his idea of writing history in constellations. Also what emerges as this vision of new humanism. I'm still sort of insisting on this because this is very interesting understanding of what binds us together. Not the idea of human nature, which is a positive concept, which very easily gets distorted. But something like human condition that rather shows itself in moments of crisis. And this is what really interests me.
Culture breaks.
So when culture breaks, what Scholler used to call tradition crisis, the moment of the sort of like breaking of tradition, the breaking of the vessels of tradition. This is where this sort of like common humanity, which you call the humanity at the edges, comes to the fore. And let me just read this beautiful quote that I really find very inspiring. The definition of universal history that begins to emerge here is this. Rather than giving multiple distinct cultures equal due, whereby people are recognized as part of humanity indirectly from the mediation of collective cultural identities, human universality emerges in the historical event at the point of rupture. It is in the discontinuity of history that people whose culture has been strained to the breaking point give expression to a humanity that goes beyond cultural limits. And it is in our emphatic identification with this raw, again, rude, free and vulnerable state that we have a chance of understanding what they say. Common humanity exists in spite of culture and its differences. A person's non-identity with the collective allows for subterranean solidarities that have a chance of appealing to universal moral sentiment, the source today of enthusiasm and hope. It is not through culture, but through the threat of culture's betrayal that consciousness of a common humanity comes to be. Universal humanity is visible at the edges. It's absolutely beautiful. I couldn't agree more. Do you want to say something more about it, or should we just open?
Shall we just agree?
And then open this to the public. I mean, I would love to discuss it more, but I think that the audience also has a lot to say.
First, short information. The book by Eric Williams was Capitalism and Slavery was very quickly translated to Polish. But nobody never this book in Poland. It is absolutely extraordinary. The second information is that in the Polish historiography we have one of the best books on the world scale on the Haitian Revolution, written by Professor Tadeusz Łebkowski, published in the 60s, and I think that it is still, I know the new literature of this revolution, and I think still it is one of the best we have. And now a short discussion. I read your book some years ago with enormous interest. It is a very important book for me. In the first place, because there is a very powerful proof of the European provincialism of Hegelian studies. You demonstrated very strongly, I think. But I have some problems with your book. And the crucial problem is the following one. You read the Haitian Revolution and the relationship between masters and slaves in Haiti in terms of Hegelian dialectic, master and slave dialectic. But I think that you don't read Hegel's dialectic in terms of Haitian Revolution. Why? Because there is, I think, no correspondence in reality between this revolution and this Hegelian dialectic. In the Haitian Revolution, what we have is the destruction of the colonial state by this revolution, the slaves taking power, and the slaves killing the master, physically killing the master, exterminating masters, their families, women, children. It is a total extermination of the colonizers. It is very close to at least some interpretations of Franz Fanon's dialectic of colonized and colonizer, and I think that not very close to the Hegelian one.
It's a comment, and it's a very legitimate comment. I was on a panel recently where there was a Caribbean scholar who tried to argue otherwise. But this violence also makes me not a Hegelian. In other words, let me put it this way. No, I'm sorry. I'm not being that clear. We do remember when Hegel was faced with the reign of terror in the French Revolution, where heads rolled like cabbages, as he says in the Phenomenology. When heads roll like cabbages, it's absolute freedom and terror. It's absolute negativity. He finds no saving grace there. It has to switch around and become Napoleon, to become a centralized state, because that is a position that is untenable. So Hegel does redeem violence. And one can do the same thing with the Haitian Revolution, and that's what this gentleman on the panel was doing. But for me, it's precisely why I'm a Benjaminian and not a Hegelian. If indeed history becomes the justification of whatever happens, because ultimately that's what Hegel is saying, because it's all the realization of reason, then we have to give up. And in the book I would argue, as Adorno does, for instance, at that moment you have to become Kantian. You have to put some sort of moral imperative as necessary part of judging history. It's the judgment, it's judgment day, it's judging history. And without some sort of moral consciousness, we're lost. We're in a Hegelian catastrophe.
Yeah, Benjamin called Hegel a mystic of violence, the worst kind that there is.
That there is.
I wanted to ask, because you brought up Koselleck and we talked about Freemasonry. So I wanted to ask, I have to ask a very vulgar, horrifying Schmittian question, which is, you know, Kosalek says that the horrible thing about Masons is they oppose three things, which is the state, hierarchy in the state, and the church. And well, I want to ask a very broad question, which is that is there any place in your thinking and the universality that you propose for neutrality? I mean, in terms of scholarship and political neutrality.
Okay, so I'm sorry, thank you. I actually use a term, which is radical neutrality. And, you know, there's a moment in the book where I say Dessalines, George W. Bush, Osama bin Laden, and Lenin, right?
Yeah.
They all, you know, they meet at that moment in history. They make one constellation, and that's a problem. So I totally agree. No disagreement.
I can read the quote. In the name of universal humanity, the vanguard justifies its own violence as higher truth. At this crossroad, Osama bin Laden meets Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Vladimir Lenin meets George W. Bush. If we do not wish to go that route, and I do not, then our tools of historical mapping are in need of radical refashioning.
What a company.
Yeah, I have a small comment maybe to the discussion already, but maybe it also could add something to the discussion of the book. But I was struck when you, Adam, you were making this point about literal and metaphorical understanding of the dialectic of slave and master and slave dialectics, because you enumerated a lot of things that you called metaphoric, which are not metaphoric at all. I mean, the relation, the class relation is also literalizable, let's say. And this brought me to a thought that maybe this question of, you know, how metaphoric is that, this story about the Haitian Revolution, and also the history of words involved in it, the Sklave thing and Knecht and so on. To what extent it is universal because it was once, and it was beautifully done by you, literalized in order to illuminate certain areas of history, but also it's then universal because it's also capable of being metaphorized in different way. Because when I was reading this book, I had a lot of times I had two impressions that are not leaving me even now. That first was the enormous actuality of what you were talking about. Actuality, I mean, you know, today talking about work and slavery is also talking about a certain zone in which they are no longer like opposed to each other, and I would say on the contrary, very, very often. And we also don't talk about it very much in political science and so on. And the second thought was that it's very, very Marxist. And that's why I would maybe suggest that one of these possible literalizations, and of course this, I don't know, now of knowability, because we can also, in a way, link these two moments, literalization and knowability, could also happen with the question of the work and with Marxist discourse as such, because I cannot see why we can anachronistically save the universal history and we couldn't do the same thing with Marxism. I mean, why not defend my Marxism against itself, and why not reread it in a Benjaminian style as you did so beautifully? Again, I have to repeat it just to be in this group, you know. No, thank you.
Okay, so I think the Marxist part of this is the brute materialism. I remember once when Irving Wolfgang, who was a very fine commentator on Benjamin, was saying something good about my work, and he was saying that it reminds him of Brecht as not a vulgar Marxist, but a brute, what did he, Plumpus denken, which is
Crude thinking.
It's crude thinking. And it is, I think, a kind of materialist insistence and a kind of, it's also a polemic against a very frequently made a frequent strategy of post-colonial, postmodern thinkers who want to talk about narrative all the time. We can't talk about truth of history. We just talk about narrative, right? So we choose another narrative, right? And so, for instance, David Scott, who writes beautifully, talks about, follows C.L.R. James talking about Toussaint Louverture in the tragic mode. In other words, what is the genre we choose? This is, it's a very strong thematics in literary criticism. And mine is really, no, let's just be, insist on this very, let's be positive. You're right, it's a positivist moment. In other words, when Adorno criticizes Benjamin and says, your work is on the crossroads between magic and positivism, or mysticism and positivism. He says magic, but he means these two elements, the theological and the Marxist. I think you have to be both places. And I'll even say rather, I mean, he calls it magic, but for Benjamin it was theology. I think that's the space where, of course you're going to have a lot of enemies, but you really got to be there. And Marx, again, also, it's this weird kind of way that certain things are not citable. I remember Helena Petrovskaya, who's a dear friend who Kezia met, I think, in Moscow, and does work, very intellectual work, rather similar to all of you. It's in the book on Green World and Utopia that I cited her. When Gorbachev came into power, people asked on the street, well, how are you feeling about the government? And she said suddenly you couldn't say anything because I fully support was precisely what you had said as a lie all the way through the other times. So there were no words because those words, you had to rupture that tradition of speaking in order to have those words work again. And, I mean, one of the things that is so blatantly with us is the fact, for instance, that global capitalism has never, I mean, no one hides it anymore. Everyone says, no, it's global capitalism that's making these horrible crises and putting people out of work. No one's apologetic anymore. They're simply saying, this is it, but they naturalize it as if it's inevitable, right? And in that situation, the problem is, and it's a problem that's not a thought problem, it's that way that thought and reality have to interrelate. People try to just resurrect Marx. Doesn't work. But we have to rescue Marx. We have to, because global capitalism isn't going away, and it's just going to become more brutal and less metaphoric, right? It's just really there. So how do you do that? I don't know. I mean, a lot of leftists who I hear talk, I can't follow them. One of them is a colleague of mine now at the Graduate Center, David Harvey. Very, very intelligent, but when he gets talking, and he knows that I'm always going to make this critique, capitalism does this, and capitalism does that. It's an absolutely anthropomorphized being with actions and, and a will, and that can't be. So I couldn't agree with you more that that's a task to do. But the question would be, how? It's hard. It's hard. And you don't do it just out of your head. Something happens. Some rupture happens. As you say, some relevance today makes something possible to say that had become impossible, and vice versa.
Can I just drop in a word, a
comment, just a small one to what Pablo said, is that I think it's very helpful. Well, there was a small misunderstanding. I mean, obviously I didn't say that workers' exploitation is a metaphor. It's a metaphor when you call it slavery, right? When you use the term slavery and but then I thought, and I think it was something that you meant in the first part of the, not the Marxist part of your question, but the first one, is that there was, you said something about the capability of something later to become a metaphor, right? So maybe what you did, and when you think of what is happening, like of our present, maybe it's like, and then it connects to the Marxist part of your question, that you say, okay, let's be more literal than Marx was, but let's be even more literal, and go down to the, let's be positivist for a second, right? And then we'll have this connection that you make in the book, and then we can see slavery as new, make new metaphors of slavery today. I mean, like to use slavery, use term slavery for this phenomenon, that phenomenon today, that the Marxist literalization doesn't capture, right? Was that? I think that's more or less what you meant. So you go down to the ground in order. No.
But it's very reconciliatory what you're saying, because you basically say that going down to the literal level has a power to revivify metaphor in a new way.
And capture
new applications.
New phenomena.
New phenomena.
Which are not captured by Marxist thought, right? By Marxist, standard Marxist, right?
But this is interesting because what you're, this is like this, that happens, that's not what the book says. That's what you as a reader, that's the connection you make.
I also defend, the literal use of the term slave today.
Yes.
I mean, let's call certain people slaves.
Slaves, because they're slaves.
Yeah.
I mean,
But yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so that's, yes.
When I mentioned this rescuing of the concept of work, which I think that already happens in Hegel, again, I didn't mean it in a Marxist, very crude Marxist way. That is, free labor. It's like, this delayed destruction of natural reality, that creates civilization. I think I also meant it in a way that it's a work that happens after the revolution, that just does not stop with the revolutionary violence, but then commemorates it, but in order for the violence never to repeat itself, so to say. So it's more like a Freudian Durchhalten, if you know what I mean. It's a work also in the matrix of history. So basically it doesn't end up in a Hegelian impasse when I'm not thinking about like Kojève from after the war, but about the Kojève that started French theory, which I think is an enormous lots of nonsense, right? That we are steeped in. I mean, I'm talking about French theory, right? It's a nonsense. From Bataille up to Lacan, it's basically one big nonsense. That is just perpetuating the impasse. But just to say, I mean, what is this interest, politically speaking? It's a Zizek, calling that we need to make a revolution right now. That is the unleashed violence, right? That will bring down the whole order, right? Kill the colonizers. And when you ask him, and then what next? He says, oh, just like Napoleon used to say, on va voir. We'll see, right? We'll see. After the reset, we'll see. Actually, the whole theory he uses will say that actually the reset will only bring, again, the same order, because the symbolic order is flowed, right, like, essentially.
Yeah. Yes.
But he still calls for the violence, which I think is precisely the Kojèvian seed. That's why I brought about Kojève with his like slight worries.
Let's go to the mic. Speaks.
Yeah.
Okay, I would like to refer to this relationship between historical materiality and philosophy. And I apologize for certain crude dimension of my question. I'm aware of that, but still I will ask it. So this jump or literalization or demetaphorization for a moment of trajectory of Hegelian thought brilliantly explains this invention of master-slave dialectics and this moment, this precious moment of universal history in Hegel. Yeah, sure. But do you have an explanation also of this later conservative turn in Hegel, who withdrawn from this kind of universal freedom? And if the question is if this materiality, precisely this materiality also of Haitian history, does not provide here a kind of explanation. I mean, this kind of failure of universal freedom through killing of the masters and through later reversal of these universal principles did not cause Hegel to think, oh, maybe they are black, they are immature, let them wait a bit and liberate themselves through work, through 2 centuries, and we'll see. Yeah? Is it the kind of this trajectory present here?
Unfortunately, it's worse, or maybe, I don't know, worse, but I mean, his later comment is slavery cannot survive in history because Christianity cannot tolerate it. Well, it did. But you also begin to reflect and say, okay, was he saying, oh, but the Haitian slaves were exposed to Christianity, that's why they were. Because, of course, he writes in the philosophy of history, he writes about the fetishism of African religions as a reason for their not even entering history. So, you know, and evidently he's even worse than I imagined, because I say in the first essay, you know, the more he read by geographers and anthropologists and everything, the dumber he became. But in fact, Bernasconi has looked very carefully at his sources, at Hegel's sources in the philosophy of history, and they are less culturally racist than Hegel. And I say that Hegel probably always was a cultural racist, not a biological one. So that's sort of too bad. And I wanted to say something else, but I forget, so.
Hegel also excluded, the Poles from the universal history. He really was a cultural racist, but the Polish Hegelians like calling to him and begging for audience. And he was saying, no, it's useless for you to study me. Poland does not belong to the history of the universal spirit.
According to Agata, he should have excluded the French.
Yes. So what I found extremely interesting in this book was showing that some things are hidden from sight. And it is not only Haiti and Hegel. I like this part that comes before, when you show that the whole European Enlightenment, this idea of freedom, was built on displacing, on hiding from view all these slaves. And this is my hypothesis that maybe this your thesis about Hegel and Haiti is so controversial precisely because of that. That it shows, and this is also the reason why it is so relevant to the present. Because nowadays we are also hiding, we are building our identity, just like the people from the Enlightenment, as free people. But our world, of course, is based on those slave-like workers in Bangladesh, in China, and so on. And also in our countries, yes. There's also slavery, literal slavery, in this enlightened, modern, freedom-loving West. So I think that this is a great idea in your book, and maybe if I think that maybe if this wasn't so difficult to accept, I think that maybe this question whether Hegel was inspired by Haiti, maybe it wouldn't be so controversial. That it just shows this, and I think that maybe this disagreement here about Marx, it was also I think that the question was not about metaphors, but it was the question was that Marx didn't see. He saw slavery of laborers here, but he just refused to see, or somehow didn't see the slavery of outside Europe. So, sorry, that's what I found extremely interesting.
But this is is also why a Benjaminian approach to philosophy is so helpful, because we mentioned this lazy existence that Hegel, you know, when the facts got in the way of his dialectical unfolding, those facts, as historically accurate as they might be, were not historically significant. They were the lazy existence that you just throw out because nothing's really happening there that matters. Okay. Now, Benjamin never allowed the concept to dominate the material content, and that's you know, that's really, you know, remember the artwork essay where in the second paragraph in the introductory remarks, Benjamin says, the concepts developed here are totally useless for fascism. I tell my students to write that, put it over their desk when they write their dissertation. Nothing in that dissertation should be useful for fascism. You know, I mean, that you really have some choices into how you articulate things. So it's not as if you couldn't articulate things differently, or you couldn't be a Heideggerian, let's just say, Heidegger, right? Because Heidegger, the fact of the matter is that Heidegger's philosophy could be useful for fascism in ways that Benjamin's could not, right? And that, or not, and I'm not sure, because there's a point in Adorno's lectures, History and Freedom, where he says, I don't know any idea that is so pure or impeccable in its political implications that you can always count on it to get you out of problems. And then you think of certain French moves like, oh, lack of closure, or the other. As long as the other is operating, then you're not doing anything politically objectionable. I mean, so you can't do that. I mean, it's a much harder thing to figure out how to articulate something in a way. But it seems to me that, you know, there's a lot of truth about the past, but it's not all relative. And that's the other thing. These constellations allow you to produce a kind of knowledge that isn't like a Kantian moral ought, nor is it a Hegelian, the oughts actually get realized in history, but that it puts the moral question up front. You can't hide it. You can't put it away. It's there. It's right at you. Not that it's solved or anything, but it's right there. And so then positivism doesn't stay positivism. It becomes its opposite, if you will. So it's, I don't know, I mean, what I love doing is not mentioning Benjamin. I mean, I can do it here, we're among friends, we're in the underground, right, the Polish underground here, and I can talk to you and mention Benjamin, etc. I don't use it in the book, maybe in a footnote or two. I don't, because I don't want it to be a Benjaminian book, because that allows you to know it before you read it, to not experience it. And I think Benjamin, everybody says, oh, he's a genius, and then they just cite, as Benjamin said, and they give one of these wonderful aphorisms, like, totally useless to fascism, I just did it, right? And you put it up there and say, wow, wow. You know, but, you know, I mean, so what I really try to do is if he's brilliant, then he's given us tools. He's given us stuff to work with, and even if we're not him. Right, so that's to me really, really important. Just one thing on the two things really bother me that haven't come up so much. One is this notion, you know, what has this got to do with institution building? Michael Hart is working on that problem in the wake of the Arab Spring, and you know, the idea of horizontal democracy, and can we have kind of anarchist-inspired institutions? Work, okay, well this we have to talk about further. So that's one thing that really, you know, I constantly comes back at me. And the other one is collective. I mean, the beauty of Marx, and that has to come into the constellation of the Haitian Revolution, is there's nothing in Marx's category of the working class that excludes blacks or Jews or any group, right? Women, well, he's weakest there. He's weakest, right? right? They're in the reproduction area, right? So, but you know what I'm saying? The worker is not does not exclude a a collective, a national collective, or any other kind of collective of that nature. But if one is not going, if one can't, and I don't think we can say, oh, the working class is about to rise up and overthrow capitalism. It doesn't make any sense to say that today. But what is the? There's a lot. There's not really anything about. There's humanism here. The idea of a humanism is nothing about a collective. Are all the collective categories, nationalism, ethnicity, language, community, religion, are all of those gone? Do they have to be gone? Are they not redeemable? Culture is a word, and I say, no, it's at the breaking point of culture. But these are the words that produce our affective investment of solidarity and collective historical project. It's no place in this book.
So, question.
So this is really nebulous and maybe kind of deflecting it onto America, which we shouldn't do, but oh well. So I was just thinking about slavery and Hegel and Dubois. I'm wondering if he fits into this. I mean, I only really know the Souls of Black. Like, I don't know if he talks about master-slave dialectic as such elsewhere, but I mean, the kind of aliens that you see more or less implicitly in Souls of Black folks seems to be kind of straightforward, the dialectic of consciousness, but the way that he kind of brutalizes it by just throwing that right onto the post-slavery subject now that needs to kind of. So I'm just wondering if you have anything more to say about that.
It's in a footnote, but it's really.
Yeah, I haven't read the book yet.
Well, there's a footnote and also Patterson, and also actually David Bryan Davis, whose folks I rely heavily on because he's just a terrific an American historian. David Bryan Davis at the end of his book says, let's imagine a discussion between Hegel and Toussaint. And of course for Du Bois, the influence of Hegel in that connection is very strong, and also Patterson, who's an African-American sociology at Harvard, has done this. But what I say in the footnote is they were doing it as if it were a metaphor, as if it were an imagined thing. But in fact, it was there. But then, what difference does it make that it was actually there? It's what you talked about. But this is terribly interesting to me, the discussion, how it's gone around the language, whether the language is factual or metaphorical. I mean, of course, a good deconstruction argument would say that all language is metaphorical. The idea of the name is some way of getting to the particular in a way that doesn't just fold into the play of words. Yeah, I just have a short footnote because I hadn't figured it out. But
it works. For me,
yeah, we'll have to talk about that more too. So you're absolutely right, but there's a footnote for you.
Waiting.
Are there any more questions? If not, maybe because we're already talking for 2 hours, and maybe let's just give a thank to Professor Buck Morss.
For her beautiful translation, for her insistence that I come, and I can't tell you how invigorating. This is after a night watching movies and not sleeping and on the airplane. So it's been very, very exciting for me. Thank you for your brilliance.
And we are also very thankful to the Museum of Contemporary Art. I'd like to say that tomorrow there's going to be a lecture by Professor Susan Buck-Morss. It's called Translocal Commons and the Global Crowd, and it will be 6 p.m. at the museum. And of course, great thanks to Agata Bielik-Robson as the moderator and inspiration for our discussion.